we have made it around the puzzle to life purpose preparation. Okay, so we're continuing to explore your life purpose. The first thing we looked at was allegiance, right? We started with allegiance. Whose am I? Who do you belong to? Who are you living for? Then, a lot of our time, really most of the time in life purpose discovery, we're spending on design because there's so many parts to it. Then we just finished passion and answering the question, why do I desire whatever it is that's in your heart? Now we're looking at what has my life prepared me for? And I have to admit, this is my favorite. I really like this one. We're looking at valuable things that have shaped your destiny. And really, not just valuable things, we're looking at everything. Because you are who you are today because of everything that has happened in your life so far. So it's skills you've learned, school, family, work, what God's been doing with your character, your self-understanding of who you are, the difficulties you've been through, even the things that you've suffered. So you're really saying, how has God prepared me through all of my life experiences? For Kevin, it's 19 and a half years. For Jessica, it's almost 18 and a half years. Mercy, for you, it's 22 years. You've experienced a lot. Now, you've got a lot more life to live and more experiences that you're going to gain. But you have experienced a lot. And you know, when we look at those things, sometimes we have questions. Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why didn't I get to go to that school? Why did my parents die? You know, all these kinds of questions. But God has a purpose, and He's going to use all those things you've been through. So again, we've done allegiance, we've looked at the design circle, we looked at the passion circle, and now we're over here. What has my life prepared me for? The life experiences that really become destiny events. You're going to see how God is going to use the things you've experienced in all those different areas to bring you to your destiny. So, let's look at preparation. You've got your notes? Okay. Now, I've said this earlier, but I want to say it again. It's never too soon or too late to discover your life purpose. So for you young people, you don't need to feel like, oh, well, Miss Twyla said that I'm not going to really get to do what I'm supposed to be doing until I'm like 30 or 40 years old. Well, but you have to begin now. And the sooner you begin to partner with God, the sooner you begin to collect all these puzzle pieces, you will come into your destiny earlier, or at least right on time. But for some people who may feel like, oh, I didn't get to know about life purpose when I was young like you. I didn't know what I was doing. I went to this school because my dad said I had to. I did this because blah, blah, blah. And now here I am, I'm 40 years old, I'm 50 years old. And what is my life purpose? My life is almost done, or half done, and I still don't even know it. It's not too late. It's not too early, and it's not too late. Again, studies in leadership development show that the journey of becoming who you are meant to be, and that's the most important thing, who you are. Then in turn, doing what you were meant to do takes decades. And we're going to see that in the life of Moses. We're going to be really looking at Moses today to help us to see how this really works. So it's never too soon to consciously partner with God in his plans. Dr. Robert Clinton, in his book, The Making of a Leader, this is one of the best books ever. If you ever want to borrow it and read it, it says the average leader is in his 50s or 60s when they begin to experience being the person and doing the tasks they were meant to fulfill. Now, that's not true of everybody, but that's kind of the average he's found. But we have to keep walking. If we aren't walking with God, you're not going to suddenly come into your destiny in your 50s and 60s if you haven't been partnering with him all along. Let's look at some key verses. I love this verse in 2 Timothy 2:21 because it's talking about us being a vessel of honor. So this is a different way of looking at your life purpose. Because if you're wanting your life to belong to God, if you want God to be able to use you, then you're like a vessel. You're like a vessel that he's going to use. This is a teapot. It's kind of hard to see there maybe. But this was taken out at Kazuri Beads where we watched them make the pottery. They're making a teapot. What's a teapot for? Tea. Right? Well, but if it's broken, if it's cracked, can you serve tea with it? No. So we want to be a vessel that God is able to use for the purpose he's created us. 2 Timothy 2:21 says, therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, he's been listing a lot of bad things that we don't want in our character. And he says, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, then he will be a vessel of honor, sanctified. Sanctified is a fancy word that means you're set aside. You're set aside for a special purpose. So you have honor, you're sanctified, you're useful for the master, prepared for every good work. If God's made you to be a teapot and you're a clean teapot, then he can use you. He can be pouring tea out through you to minister to all kinds of people in all kinds of places. Another great verse is Romans 8:28 and 29. For we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of Jesus, the image of his son. So this one tells us a lot. I think this verse is very encouraging because we usually quote this verse when things have gone bad, right? When somebody's died, maybe we've lost our job, maybe we've been sick, maybe there's been a pandemic and we've missed like a year of our life. That you didn't get to be going to school or doing what you thought you were going to do. But this verse says, but we know that God causes all things to work together for good. So as bad as it looks to us, God is able to turn it around. It doesn't mean that somebody dying is good, or a pandemic is good, or a car accident is good. It doesn't mean that. But it means that what the devil would have used to destroy us, God is able to turn it around and bring good out of it. If we love God and we're called according to his purpose, again, it's not really my life purpose. We talk about life purpose discovery. It's not my life purpose discovery. It's really discovering God's life purpose for me. Why? Because those he foreknew. Did God foreknow you? Yeah. He knew you before you were even born. And he had a plan for your life. We see that in Jeremiah 29:11. And not only did he know about your life and have a plan for your life, but he's also predestined. That means he has already planned ahead that you're going to be conformed to the image of Jesus. And this pot, I love these pots. These are very special pots from Japan. Because usually, if a pot gets broken, what do? You throw it away, right? I mean, if it's a cooking pot and it's broken, well, you can't cook in it anymore. If it's a teapot and it's cracked and it won't hold tea anymore, we throw it away. But I have good news for you. When you get cracked, God does not throw you away. What they do in Japan, these are expensive pottery, very expensive pottery. And when something happens and it got cracked, do you know what they did? They filled those cracks. That's not glue. It's filled with gold. Real gold. So this pot is worth a lot more money than it was before it got broken. And I think you're going to see from our study of Moses today that he had to be broken. God couldn't really use Moses the way he was. But after he was broken, God could use him. Very often, we may be trying to live our own life our own way. We may be trying to live our life in our own strength. We may be proud of what we can do and of our strengths and talents, and so we're trying to use those for God. And we have to be broken. But when we're broken, God doesn't throw us away. Instead, he repairs us with gold, and he's able to use us far more after the breaking than before. Here's another great verse. Isaiah 25:1 says, "O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name. For you have worked wonders, plans." Notice, plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness. You know, this person who's painting these cups, they had a plan, right? They had a plan for the cups, the shape of the cups, the color that they're going to paint the cups, how they're going to design the cups so that each one is special. That's you. God had a plan long ago. And he's faithful. He's perfectly faithful to continue his work in you and to keep forming you so that you can be a blessing to others. Your life can be blessed and you can glorify him. And of course, the best scripture, I think, is about the potter and the clay from Jeremiah 18:1-6. It says, "The word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will announce my words to you. So I went down to the potter's house, and there he was making something on the wheel. But the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled. It was spoiled in the hand of the potter. So he made it into another vessel, as it pleased the potter to make it. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Can I not, O house of Israel, deal with you as this potter does, declares the Lord. Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel." God is the potter, we're the clay. And that's really what we were talking about in design. How has God designed you? How has he shaped you? How has he shaped your body? What strengths and weaknesses has he put in you? What personality did he form you with? And then when you gave your life to Jesus, your new identity, who you are in Christ, and the spiritual gifts that now he wants to demonstrate through you because the Holy Spirit lives inside of you. So you're not only a vessel for God, but you're a vessel that is the home of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit lives inside of you. And so God is the one who has shaped us. He's the one who has the plan for our life. So we just need to follow him. Well, let's look at the life of Moses. I love the life of Moses. And I think all of you, or most of you, have also watched the movie The 10 Commandments. Do you remember that one? Where we could really see about the life of Moses. And there's a lot about Moses. Moses is one of the main characters in the Bible. Not as primary as Jesus, but Moses is probably number 2. Because all of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy tell about his life. He wrote those 4 books, and he wrote the book of Genesis. So 5 of the books of the Bible were written by Moses. Those 4 books tell about his life, plus there's passages in the New Testament. In Acts 7, verses 17 through 44, and Hebrews 11, 23 through 29. It talks about Moses. So we're gonna let that tell us the story then about what happened to Moses. And I think most of you have probably heard these stories your whole life when you went to Sunday school. But we're going to get some new lessons out of them for us today. Now, one thing you need to understand is that when we're talking about God preparing us, it's like God leading you from tree to tree. I want you to imagine that you're in a forest. Have you ever been in a forest with big trees? It's easy to get lost in there. Well, God is leading us on a journey, right? We've said that's what life purpose is. That's what life is a journey. We're on a safari from the time we're born until the time we die. We're on a safari. But where do we go? How do we know the way to go? Well, God is leading us from one tree to another. The Dr. Les's coaching students who are studying coach training, they study about this. And they look at some of the same stuff we're looking at so that they can see where God has led them in their life. Because if you're going to get some more clues about what God's been doing, where he has taken you, and where he is taking you, you've got to look at your life. You've got to look at that life journey and identify these trees. So let's look at what Moses learned in the first 40 years of his life. You see, God has a clock. It's not like our clock, but God has a prophetic time clock. And he had even said to Abraham that the Jewish people were going to end up as slaves in Egypt for 400 years. He told Joseph that, before Joseph died, because remember it was Joseph who got all the Jews down into Egypt in the first place. We're going to talk about him tomorrow. But when the children of Israel went down into Egypt, they weren't slaves, but they became slaves. And he said that he had a 400-year plan before he delivered them. So the clock was ticking, and the time was almost up. Now, you remember the story about Moses being born, right? He was born at a time that you did not want to have babies in Egypt. Kind of like the story of when Jesus was born, and Herod sent all the soldiers to Bethlehem. And what did they do? They killed all the baby boys who were 2 years old and younger. Well, it was the same kind of thing in Egypt. Because what had happened was the children of Israel, all the Jews were down there, they were slaves. But the Egyptians began to get afraid that there were going to be more slaves than there were Egyptians. And if that happened, they could get free, right? They could fight and get free. So they decided, well, you know what? We'll keep the women. Girl babies are okay because, they can work and they're not going to fight. They hadn't thought about women being soldiers or fighting, so they figured they were safe with the women. But they just said, Pharaoh made a law that if a baby boy was born, he had to be killed immediately. So if you were giving birth and your baby was born and it was a boy, he was supposed to be killed right then. Can you imagine how horrible that would be? Well, fortunately, there were a couple of midwives who thought, this is horrible. We're not going to do that. So when baby Moses was born, his mother, he was not killed, and his mother decided it was better to hide him. So she hid him as long as she could. But when a baby's crying and making a lot of noise, you can't hide him for long. So she decided, you know what? I'm going to have to just put him in a basket on the river Nile and leave him in God's hand. If the basket sinks and he drowns, if a crocodile eats him, if he floats and somebody takes him and protect, whatever God wants with this baby, he's in God's hands. Because if he stays here, he's going to be killed. Can you imagine what a hard decision that was for his mother? But you see, God did have a plan. God had a plan for Moses' life. He had a very, very special plan for Moses. So Moses gets put in the basket. The basket gets sent down the river. Now his big sister Miriam, she was like 12 years old. She's hiding in the bushes and the reeds along the river. She's watching, right? Remember that story? She's watching to see what happens to baby Moses. And who finds him? The princess. Oh my gosh, not just anybody, not just any woman, but Pharaoh's own daughter. So here's Pharaoh. He's made a rule that all the baby boys have to be killed. And it's his daughter who finds baby Moses. So she draws him out of the water, and that's what the word Moses means. The name Moses means drawn out from the water, because he was drawn out of the river. Now, the Egyptians didn't worship the real God. They had all kinds of gods that looked like frogs and dogs and all kinds. And she believed there was a god of the river Nile. So she said, oh, the Nile River God has given me a baby, because she couldn't have a baby. So she took Moses. So Moses starts out life being born to slaves. You might say that the first tree he goes to is the river Nile. That was his first experience in life, was being put in a basket on the river Nile. And then what tree does he go to? He ends up in the palace. What a turn of events. He goes from being a Hebrew slave baby to living in Pharaoh's palace. And he lived there for 40 years. So twice your age. Twice your age. So imagine, now he's growing up. He has the best clothes. He has the best teachers. He has all the food, all the money, everything he could possibly want. At that time, Egypt was the top country in the world. It was the strongest militarily, the richest. So he is at the top of the food chain, okay? He is in the best position. And so he learned a lot. He learned math, he learned languages, he learned business, he learned warfare. I mean, he learned a lot of things in those first 40 years. And all of that, as crazy as it seems, all of that was part of God's plan. God was preparing him. Now, he probably thought that God was preparing him to maybe be Pharaoh, or at least be one of the top government officials in Pharaoh's court. But God had bigger plans than that. That wasn't what God was preparing him for. The clock was ticking. The clock was ticking. And God had a deliverer. God already had a plan for Moses to be that deliverer. But how was Moses going to deliver the children of Israel? Was he going to deliver them because he was in the palace? And so maybe someday he would be the king, he would be Pharaoh, and then he could just set all the slaves free? Well, no, it wasn't going to go that way. So what was going to happen? You know, I don't know at what point Moses realized he was the deliverer. You know, at some point, he just went from being Mo, you know, in the palace, to realizing I'm the one God's going to use to deliver the children of Israel. So however he figured that out, but you know, his plan for delivering them didn't work, did it? Because he goes out to visit the children of Israel, the Hebrews who were slaves, and he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews. And he kills him. Now, you're not going to set the Hebrews free by killing one Egyptian every day. Okay? That's not going to work. And of course, he tried to hide the body. He hid the body under the sand. But they have a lot of wind there, and at night, the wind blew and it blew all the sand off. You know, I could preach a whole sermon on that, Kevin, because, you know, when you think you're going to cover up your sin, the winds of God blow, and it exposed it. And when they found out, even though Moses lived in the palace, even though he was the princess's son, when they found out he had murdered somebody, you're still in trouble, right? Even if you're the president of a country, if you've murdered somebody and you get caught, you're going to prison or you're going to be killed. So they're out to get him. So Moses has to run away. He has to run away. So he goes from the Nile River to the palace where he's been his whole life for 40 years, and now he's living out in the desert. Mercy J was teaching the kids yesterday about the desert. Well, the desert is horrible. It's dry. You can die in the desert if you don't know where to find the water. There's not trees to hide under unless it's at the water. There's a few palm trees that make an oasis. So now he is, and really when he went to the wilderness, I mean, that was pretty much a death sentence. They probably figured that's the end of Moses. We'll never hear from that guy again. We'll just find his bones out there somewhere in the sand maybe someday. But God had a plan. This is where Moses began to be broken. This is where Moses found out that he had to trust God. This is where Moses found out that all of his training, all of his education, all of his money was not going to do him any good, because none of that was going to help you if you're living in the desert. It's great if you're living in the palace, but it's worthless if you're living in the desert. God had sent him, really. It was his attachment. God said, I think Moses needs an attachment. He needs to learn some lessons. He needed to learn all kinds of lessons. Moses had to learn that it wasn't about him. It wasn't about his strength. Even though he was handsome and smart and rich, he wasn't going to be able to deliver the children of Israel. Only God could do that. And if God was going to use him, he was going to have to humble himself. He was going to have to be broken. He was really going to become a nobody. Can you imagine living in the palace for 40 years? And I mean, everybody knows you. You're famous. It's like you're on TV every night. You're in the newspaper. You know, everybody knows Moses. Oh, there's Moses. Oh, look what Moses is wearing today. I mean, everybody wants to be him. Now he's wearing animal skins. Probably like John the Baptist out in the desert. He's nobody. Out in the desert, when he tells them his name, they go, okay, who's that? They haven't heard of Moses in Egypt. They don't know who he is. He's not anybody important. He's going to have to work. So he gets a job. He was at the point of death when he found a well. And there was Jethro's daughters. Jethro had a bunch of daughters. I think it was like 7 daughters. And he helped them fight off some bad shepherds. And so they took him to their father. And their father gave him a job. He got a job, Kevin. Herding sheep. So again, here he's gone from having all the money in the world to nothing. He's gone from being a leader of thousands or millions of people to taking care of some sheep. Imagine. Can you imagine what Moses was thinking? I want you to think for a minute. Because I have felt like Moses did sometimes. You know, when things go badly, when you think you failed. You know, when Moses killed the Egyptian and then it was found out, you know what I bet Moses thought? I bet he thought, I have screwed up. I blew it. God was going to use me, and what was I thinking? I killed somebody, and now all of God's plans for me are just thrown in the trash. Taka. He probably thought it was too late. He thought his life was over. Oh, great. Now I get to spend the rest of my life in the desert taking care of a bunch of sheep. But you know what? Now, Jeremiah had not written this yet. This would be a lot later that Jeremiah said this. But it was still true. Moses didn't know it yet. But God was sitting in heaven saying, Moses, I know the plans that I have for you. Plans for welfare and not for calamity, to give you a future and a hope. And to deliver Israel, and to take care of millions of people. are going to be saved because of you. Well, Moses didn't know that. And he was probably feeling really, really bad for another 40 years. Listen, that's older than me. I can't imagine. I mean, I've gone through some hard parts in my life, but not 40 years of hard part. You see, he probably thought his life was over, but what he didn't understand was God was just getting started. God was just getting started. God was saying, yep, you did a great job learning all that stuff in the palace for 40 years. You know what? I've got some more stuff now for you to learn. And now is the time. Now is the time to fulfill your destiny. You know, at the end of the 40 years, imagine 40 years, he's just living out there in the desert, taking care of the sheep. He married one of Jethro's daughters. He had 2 boys. He's teaching them how to take care of sheep. He's living in a tent. But something happens, doesn't it? One day something happened. You see, he saw a fire burning on the side of the mountain. He saw a bush burning, but it wasn't burned up. We put wood in the fireplace, don't we? And you guys use wood in the chimney. Imagine if you built the fire and it burned and it burned and it burned and it burned, but it never burned. It never burned up. That's what he saw. And so he went to see. The Bible says he went to see what that was. And that's where he met God. He met God at the burning bush. And at the burning bush, God told him, remove your shoes. You're standing on holy ground. And he began to tell Moses what he wanted Moses to do. You know, the problem with Moses was that the man that God spent 40 years preparing to be the deliverer in Egypt, then he spent another 40 years preparing him in the wilderness. He still felt totally unprepared. Moses didn't see the connection. He didn't see the connection between his preparation and his destiny. And that's why I'm talking to you. I want you to begin to connect some dots. Now, you may not be able to connect all the dots because you've got some more life to live. It may not be time to connect all the dots yet. But if you know that the dots connect, you can be watching. You can be watching for the next dots. Moses was prepared in a role that was outside the area of his calling. Now, what does that mean? God was going to use Moses to deliver several million people, about 3 million people. He was going to be taking care of the people. He was going to be teaching the people about God. He was going to be leading the people through the wilderness. He was going to be a judge over Israel. If they had an argument, if they didn't understand, he was the judge too. So he was going to be doing all of this with people. But is that the training God gave him? No, God had him taking care of sheep. So there was a connection. You see, he was learning, we're going to see in a minute, all that he was learning out in the wilderness. And he was learning to take care of sheep. And you know what? Unfortunately, most people are like sheep. So if you know how to take care of sheep, you'll know how to take care of people. But see, it looked like 2 totally different things, didn't it? God is using your experiences to prepare you, to teach you, to train you about your future and what you're going to need. But right now, you probably just look at school and go, well, I went to school. Now, I'm at Nana's house. Where's the connection? But there is. There is a connection. God often trains us in skills. We've talked about skills. Skills are the things you build on your strengths, right? He often trains us in skills and our character that our destiny is going to require. Of course, we don't know what it is. If you don't know your destiny, you're not preparing. I want you to notice, this is not you preparing. This is God preparing you. Preparation is what God is doing in you because He knows the future. So He knows what Kevin needs to learn now. Kevin, you don't have a clue. But God has a plan, and He knows what you need to learn to prepare you for that destiny. God had a plan for Moses, and He was going to use everything Moses had learned in the palace and everything Moses had learned in the wilderness to prepare him to be the leader he had to be. But He did it in a place that seemed totally disconnected from what we think we're supposed to do. And then Moses' struggle was even harder because his character preparation required removing him from a position that was very much like his ultimate role. You know, when he was a leader, a ruler in the palace, and he was managing people, overseeing people, making big decisions, that was more like what he was going to do later, right? But God removed him from there and sent him to the wilderness to finish his preparation. So he was actually removed from a place that you would think was going to prepare him because God knew he'd already learned everything he needed to learn there. Moses didn't recognize what God was doing. He probably didn't have a clue. He was like most of us. He thought, well, yeah, I'm happy God saved me from drowning in the Nile or being killed when I was born, but then I had this great life in the palace. And I don't blame God for the wilderness. It was my fault. I screwed up. I murdered somebody. But then, now, I'm just going to live the rest of my life until I die out here in the wilderness, doing nothing but taking care of sheep and being a nobody. And he didn't see that, no, your life is not over. You are still right on schedule for what God wants to do with you. He did not understand what his destiny required of him, and he didn't understand the ways of God in preparing his leadership character. The kind of person that Moses was when he was living in the palace is probably not at all like the man he was in the desert. In the desert, he learned to trust God. In the desert, he learned about God's holiness. He learned that God's a God of miracles when he was in the wilderness. It changed his heart. It changed his character. So let's look at some of the ways Moses was being prepared. What did he learn when he was taking care of Jethro's sheep? Think about it. He was a Hebrew. who had lived like an Egyptian, but now he's out in the desert. He was the only Hebrew. He was the only Hebrew on the face of the earth who knew how to survive in the desert, where the roads were, where the springs and the oases were, where the best grazing for the cattle at different times of the year was, what plants were poisonous and which ones could you eat. He knew about the wild animals in the desert and how to handle them. He understood what the local customs were, and he even knew where the Egyptian forts and guarded places were. This was a lot of what God was teaching. But like I say, even more importantly, he was learning to depend on God. He was learning to obey God. He was learning to trust God. He was learning to worship God more than anything else. So God knew what he was doing. Moses had learned the basic leadership and cultural skills in Egypt for the first 40 years. And he learned the practical desert skills plus character, humility, and utter dependence on God in the second 40 years. Everything in Moses' life, from his birth to his upbringing, in his years tending sheep, all of that fed into his calling. And so at 80 years old, when most of us figure it's time to curl up and die, he was finally ready. He was finally ready at age 80 to do what God had called him to do. Moses' whole life had prepared him for what he was born to do in his third set of 40 years. He lived to be 120. So, what is preparation? It's the sum total of experiences in life that make you ready for your destiny. So studying what God has taken you through reveals themes and connections that point toward your calling. And what's common in preparation is experiencing a lifestyle and sufferings of those that you're called to serve. We're going to come back to this again when we talk about calling. But very often, the things that you've suffered, it's like they get written on your heart. And very often, then that's part of the calling. You've experienced it. Now you can minister to other people. We've talked about orphans. Who understands about orphans? Orphans. You have to be an orphan to really understand the life of orphans, right? And I think that's why you guys have a heart for other orphans. I think that's why Miss Pawe has a heart for you. Out of your own suffering, then, you have a compassion. You have an understanding. You've experienced things that then draw you to certain people that you're going to serve. Think about Jesus. You know, one of the reasons we love Jesus so much, and one of the reasons I think we feel like we can turn to Jesus and pray to Jesus, is because he wasn't just this faraway God on a throne. Jesus left heaven. He gave up that throne. He laid aside being God, and he came to this earth and was born as a baby. And he lived for 30 years before he even started to minister. There's only 3 years that Jesus preached and did miracles and taught and worked with his disciples and all through. The other 30 years, he was hungry, like you get hungry. He got tired, like we get tired. He got thirsty. He had a job. He worked in a carpenter shop. He built tables. Man, I wish I could have owned a table that I could say was made by Jesus, right? Jesus made this table. So he knew what it was like. He knew Mercy Jake's going to be teaching the kids in Bible Club next week about the temptation. He was tempted, just like we're tempted. The only difference is the Bible says he didn't sin. Too often when we're tempted, we give in to the temptation. But Jesus didn't. But you see, Jesus can now identify with us. And we can identify with him. It says in the New Testament, we don't have a high priest who's, way up there. We have a high priest who has suffered in every point like we do. So we know he understands. When we're sad, he understands. When we're crying because somebody we love died, he knows what that's like. Remember how he wept at the tomb of Lazarus? Yeah, he had a best friend who died too. So he understands us. So think about Moses. He started at the Nile River. Then he learned a lot of things at Pharaoh's palace. He learned as much or more in the wilderness. He met God. This was the turning point. This was where he met God. This is where he got his commission. This is where God said, I'm sending you back to Egypt. He was probably like, what? You're sending me where? Don't you know they're still probably ready to kill me? And can you imagine Moses going, wait. If you had sent me back 35 years ago, even 30 years ago, I would still have been a young man. I'm old. I'm tired. He said, do you know what he said to God? He said, I can't even talk right. Can you imagine how he probably talked when he was 40? With all that training, he probably could get up and give speeches and everything. Now he's been out there with the sheep and he goes, blah, 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 blah. I mean, the only people I talk to are sheep. Don't ask. I mean, I can't do it. I can't do it. But God was sending him back to Egypt. And God was sending him back not as Moses, not in Moses' power. He was God's representative. He was speaking for God. And God was going to work miracles through him. Remember, he had just that shepherd's staff? He had this stick of wood that he used when he was out there in the desert. And now he could throw it down and it could become a snake. He could touch the Nile River and the Nile River turned to blood. He could call down the plagues on the nation of Egypt. Later, he was going to hold up that rod over the Red Sea and it was going to part. When the people didn't have water, he was going to hit that rock and water was going to come out. Enough water for 3 million people, plus all their animals. But you see, now it wasn't just Moses' rod. It was going to be the rod of God. God was the one who was going to use it to do his will. So I want you to think back. Your assignment, in fact, let me give this to you. Pass this down. I want you to begin thinking about what has happened in your life. It could be things you experienced in your early life. It could be suffering, adversity. Things that are usually a mystery. Like I say, we usually go, God, why did that happen? Why did you let that happen? Later, after you've learned to trust God in things you don't understand, you're going to begin to perceive how He has intricately woven His purposes for you throughout every experience in your life. In other words, Romans 8:28 and 29. That even the bad things He's able to bring good. He's able to turn it around so that you learn good lessons even out of bad experiences. It's going to enable you to fully function in your design. You know, in design, what we were looking at is called nature. We said that your design is what you're born with. Most of what we looked at in design was nature. It was what you were born with. And then we did look at some things you were reborn with. But preparation is what's called nurture. It's not nature. It looks almost the same, but it's nurture. It's all the things that have happened. Nurture is really shaping. We talked about the potter shaping the clay. Nurture are the things in your life, the experiences in your life. Some of them good, some of them bad, some of them you may understand, some of them you may not understand, but all of them have shaped you. So it's going to include your learned skills, your qualifications, your credentials, the favor that you have, the networks. Do you know that even the people you knew up country, Mercy, the other girls in school, the teachers you've had, they're a part of your network. You know, you may not have any idea why you met them or what that relationship is about, but someday you may be calling them or they may be calling you. It may be one of those girls that moves to Nairobi and starts a business and you get hired. It's just crazy the way God works all of these things. It is like weaving, where the fabric is woven together, and all these things, even your accomplishments and also your failures, get woven together into your future. Much of a leader's preparation focuses on character development, not just skills. So it's not just who you know, it's not just what you know, it's not just what you know to do. But again, God has been shaping your character. If your character's wrong, if there's areas of sin, if there's areas that you won't give to God, if there are areas where you're flawed, that can stop your destiny. We talked about Saul, King Saul. That's what happened with him. Lots of people in the Bible. Think about Judas. Judas was one of the chosen, one of the apostles. He got to spend 3 years with Jesus. I'd like to spend 3 years like that with Jesus. He got to spend 3 years with, he got a front row seat for watching all the miracles. He was standing right there when blind eyes were opened, when lame people were healed. What a tremendous ministry. What a tremendous apostle he could have been. Right? The character wasn't there. Character wasn't there. He got disillusioned with Jesus. He didn't like the fact that Jesus was always giving away money. You know, Jesus just didn't care about money. And Judas did. Judas was the treasurer. And he wanted to see them get rich. And Jesus didn't care about money. He wanted Jesus to overthrow the Romans. Jesus was setting up a different kind of kingdom. He wasn't going to overthrow the Romans. He was going to overthrow the devil and all of the world's governments that are not right. Judas lost everything for 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver, which he ended up throwing down and leaving anyway. And he went out and hung himself. He killed himself. He threw it all away. He didn't have a character. Without character building experiences of preparation, your design won't accomplish much of lasting value. So you could be the smartest, the most beautiful, you could have amazing skills. If you don't have a character, good luck. We'll see how far you get without God. Just doesn't work that way. So, you're going to be asking yourself, what have I experienced? How are those experiences valuable? How can they be used? How do those experiences give me practical skills for what I'm called to do? How have those experiences given me the character qualities that I need to reach my destiny? So when we're talking about preparation, we're really talking about everything. We're talking about family. We're talking about education. We're talking about travel, the places you've been. We're talking about your language, your ethnicity, your tribe. We're talking about the good things that have happened to you and the bad things. It's everything, just like it was for Moses. You're going to be thinking about, what trees have I been to? You know, where were you born? What happened at that tree? That may be harder to remember, but you may know some things about it. Your grandmother or your parent may have told you something about where you were born, what was going on there. And then what? What took you to the next tree? Maybe it was a move that you made. Maybe it was going from one place in Kenya to another. Maybe the next tree was the death of your parents. Maybe it was going to live with a grandmother or another relative. Maybe it was the schools. Another tree would have been the school that you went to, especially secondary school. Another tree was meeting me. Or coming to Nana's house. Where has your journey led? So you can think of it several different ways when you begin to write down on your paper. You can begin to think of different lessons you've learned. You can think of different people and places. You can think of it as different trees, different places you've been, to help you to see what you've been through. We're going to look tomorrow, we're going to start looking at some preparation principles. Because God will take you through some experiences that will help you to identify with those you're called to serve. And I mentioned earlier, Moses, you see, at some point, now in the movie The Ten Commandments, they kind of made up this whole story about how Moses found out he was a Hebrew. That's really not the way it sounds in the Bible. But at some point, he began to identify with the Hebrews and not the Egyptians. He was raised as an Egyptian, but at some point he found out he was a Hebrew, and he began to be concerned about the people who were in slavery. I can identify with that, especially, there's a lot of areas of my life, but I'll just share one of them. One of them has been my journey about grief. I've been a Christian for 48 years, about 48 and a half years. Les and I have pastored a lot of churches. We've had different people we know have died. Our grandparents died. And he did lots of funerals for people. But you know what? I didn't understand grief until my son died. When Caleb died in 2013, I thought I would die. I thought my life was over. I went through such a dark period. I struggled so much. I felt so bad. And working through all of that with God, working through praying, crying, suffering. And it was really out of that experience. And then it was just 3 years later that my mother died, Nina. And that grief was different because she was older. But I didn't think she was going to die then. I thought she was going to live a lot more years. And so I had some different feelings about grief. But I still learned more about grief. And it was after those two experiences of losing Caleb and my mother that I came back to Kenya. And do you remember what happened after I got home? 2 weeks later, I fell and broke my leg. Remember the broken leg? Well, it was during that time of me having a broken leg and not being able to be up and walking and everything that God told me to write a book about grief. And a lot of people in Kenya have bought that book. A lot of people in the U.S. have bought that book. And so my story about my own grief and the lessons that I learned about grief, God has now used to help other people in their grief. So it is the hard things that we go through that God is able to soften our heart and turn our heart and use our heart, use what we've learned to help others. So your homework is to just think about all those different lessons. List as many as you can. This is another one of those lists, just like we've talked about in design and passion, that you probably aren't going to finish because you're going to keep finding more things. So in 6 months, in a year, in 3 years, you still may be writing things and adding them to this list. But write down as much as you can see now. And don't forget the present. Because like Kevin, even now this 6 months that you're going to have during the pandemic of 2020, that you got to come and live at Nana's house. That you didn't think you'd get to do until you finished Form 4, right? This year, these 6 months that you have sharing a room with Jerry and John and Evans, that's important. I don't know what it means. You may not know what it means. You may not know how it matters, but let me tell you what. This is a special experience. This is a special time. Because when you finish Form 4 in 2 years and you come back to live here, Jerry will probably be gone. I don't know if John and Evans will be here. There may be some new guys. I mean, this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime chance to be with these guys. So write it down. Again, you may not know what it means, but you know it's special. It's special because God's doing it. Even if you don't know all that it means and where it's going to lead to. Why it matters.